Content warning. This audiobook contains strong language, sexual themes, supernatural elements, and graphic depictions of death. The author recommends this work for audiences aged 18 and over. If you let your 6-year-old listen, that's on you. Moloch, The Real King of Horror by Ian Bailey. Published by Ashlar Press. Copyright 2025. Introduction by Ian Bailey. You won't get to breathe. That's not a warning, it's a design feature. The man at the center of this story doesn't get a moment of peace, and neither will you. I didn't write this book for comfort. I wrote it to trap you, to put you inside the crawl space where he lives, where every word tastes like ash, and every shadow might speak. If you're still reading, you've already opened the door. The thing behind it is patient, but it's not kind. Moloch is the second book in the dark matter mythos. The mythos began with dark matter, the Order of the Hidden Cross, a metaphysical descent into fractured timelines, dimensional bleed, and esoteric truths buried beneath centuries of religious control. That book follows Joshua Carpenter, a child born with the ability to see what others cannot. From the moment of his birth, something has been whispering to him across dimensions. With the help of Barris, a strange and sometimes unreliable companion, Joshua learns to navigate these fractures, not to conquer them, but to listen, to find the source of the whisper, and understand why it chose him. Moloch is not a sequel. There are no returning characters, no plot line to pick up where the last left off. You can read either book first or alone, and it will still find you. But they are connected, not through events, but through gravity, through something older, something with teeth. Where dark matter explored the outer edges of forbidden knowledge, Moloch turns inward. This is the story of a writer, a man who wanted a quiet life, a steady one. But when a manuscript he never meant to share finds its way into the world, published without his consent, everything changes. The book is a hit, the voice returns, and the whisper becomes a demand. Its name is Moloch. His presence predates humanity. He is older than language, but wears many names. In some stories he is a god of fire. In others, a machine A principle, an instinct. In this one he wears a smile. He feeds not only on children, but on what births them: love, sacrifice, dreams, art. Moloch is what happens when creation forgets why it began. He appears in thresholds, in bargains, in the silence between inspiration and decay. The writer spirals. His success feeds him, but hollows him out. Each book comes faster, less his, more automatic. He writes in trances, wakes up to pages he doesn't remember crafting, smiles he didn't mean, words not his own. His wife, Martha, watches as he slips, not immediately, not all at once, but with the steady erosion of something being consumed from the inside. She has her own weight to carry, and eventually her own line to cross. Moloch is not a possession story in the usual sense. There are no spinning heads, no holy water. What occurs here is quieter, colder, and harder to name. It lives in ambition, in guilt, in the slow trade of truth for attention. The supernatural bleeds into the domestic, and what begins as whispers becomes intrusion, into dreams, into speech, into blood. Like dark matter, this book contains artifacts, fragments of newspaper clippings, annotated texts, found pages. These are not set dressing. They are evidence. If dark matter opened the kaleidoscope, Moloch twists it. The patterns shift, the symbols repeat. A name written in too many hands. A child speaking a line he could not know. These echoes are not accidents. Both books exist inside a continuum, a mythos that expands not outward, but inward, through time, through grief, through cracks in the soul. There is no chosen one, no salvation, just a growing awareness that what waits behind the veil is no longer waiting. You do not need to read these books in order, but if you read them both, you'll begin to feel the shape of something moving beneath, something that was always there. This isn't fiction. Not exactly, it's a kind of a ritual. It's conjuring. And if your hands are on this book, then you're already part of it. You think you're safe because you'll close the last page, but I'm still here, and I'm hungry again. Chapter 1. The Struggling Writer. Lately, everything read like a rejection letter, thin, impersonal, full of words that weren't for him. The kitchen smelled of strong coffee and burnt toast, the warm aroma almost masking the lingering trace of yesterday's dinner, sausages, garlic, and tomato sauce. Faintly sour morning light streamed in through the blinds, cutting the room into stripes of harsh white and soft shadow. As he sat hunched at the table, his eyes locked on the O2 thin envelope resting under his fingertips. It was from Quill and Paper Publishing, and it carried the weight of a truth he had learned to anticipate. Rejection. Across the kitchen, Martha moved quickly, one eye on the kids and the other on the clock. She wore her favorite flannel robe, and her bare feet padded softly against the linoleum floor as she worked to keep Grace and Alex from breaking into a full-fledged argument over breakfast. Their shrill voices rose and fell like tiny waves crashing against a fragile dam, their energy too much for this early in the morning. "Share, please," Martha said, her voice tight with forced calm as she slid a plate of toast halves in front of them. The struggling writer sighed and fingered the edge of the envelope. He knew how this would play out. He could already feel the creeping heat of frustration gathering in his chest, like kindling before a flame. He ripped open the envelope, his eyes scanning the page quickly. "Thank you for your recent submission. After careful consideration," it was the same line as always, the one they all used. Rejection with a polite face, dressed in the same hollow words. He crumpled the letter into a tight ball, the paper crunching under his grip like dry leaves, and he tossed it into the trash with a flick of his wrist, hoping to bury it along with his irritation. For a second his mind wandered, imagining the paper not in the trash, but somewhere else, floating in flames, turning to ash like everything else he tried to create. Martha's eyes flicked to the trash, then back to him. "Another one?" she asked, careful not to press too hard. He took a sip of his coffee. "Yeah," he muttered, the word dropping like a stone in his mouth. Without hesitation, Martha walked over to the trash, bent down and picked out the balled-up letter. The tension in her shoulders seemed to soften as she smoothed the paper flat, her fingers moving over each crease, as if the act of straightening it could somehow take away the rejection's sting. With a touch of sarcasm in her voice, she read aloud, "Dear Sir, thank you for your recent submission. After careful consideration, we regret to inform you that the world is simply not ready for what you have to offer. Your work delves into the supernatural horror genre in a manner that, while undeniably unique, left us pondering whether the real horror is your narrative or the devil himself punching in for a day at the office. Might we suggest a change of direction? Perhaps something a little more wholesome, a story with fewer demonic encounters and more of life's gentler moments might better capture your audience's hearts and leave fewer of them clutching their crucifixes. Kind regards, Quill and Paper Publishing." She shook her head and laughed, but her laugh had an edge, like trying to joke away a bad smell that wouldn't leave. "That's just ridiculous," she said, meeting his eyes with a soft smile. "It's funny, though. I'll give them that." She walked over to the credenza just off the kitchen, opening a small wooden box with a heavy sigh. It was already mostly full, crammed with folded letters, some yellowing at the edges from age, others stark white and freshly read. "Maybe we should bind these up, turn 'em into a book," she said, mouth twisted. "Could call it Thanks, but no thanks." He forced a smile, but didn't respond, watching as she carefully slid the latest rejection in among its siblings. He didn't have the energy to argue, but the idea of those letters as a book felt too vivid. Maybe it was all he'd ever write, a collection of failures. He imagined that book, a black cover, no title, and all those rejections printed back to back, mocking him page after page. "You're really keeping all of them?" "Of course," Martha said, closing the box and running a thumb over its grain. "One day, when you're rich and famous, you'll want to look back on these and laugh." The kids' bickering grew louder, breaking the fragile calm in the room. Alex had snatched the last slice of toast, and Grace was tugging at it like a dog gnawing at a bone. "It's mine," she whined, high-pitched and piercing. The struggling writer winced, feeling the noise grate against his already frayed nerves. He grabbed his coffee, muttered, "I'll be in my office," and walked away before the argument escalated further. His office was a cramped little nook off the kitchen, really just a corner of the room where he'd jammed a tiny desk and a battered typewriter. Piles of paper sat in precarious stacks, some covered in notes, others marked with red ink, the ruins of stories that had never made it past their first drafts. He sat down, his chair creaking under his weight. The typewriter stared back at him, blank and expectant. He took a deep breath and began to type. The baby's first cry split the night like a war horn. He stopped. The sentence looked all wrong, awkward and stiff, like a stranger wearing his clothes. He yanked the page out of the typewriter, crumpled it in his fist, and tossed it across the room. He's good at that. The paper hit the wall and bounced onto a growing pile of failures. For a moment, he thought about the edge of his desk, how sharp it was, how it might feel pressed against his head if he fell onto it. He shook his head, trying to dislodge the thought. It wasn't the first time something like that had crossed his mind, and he hated that the dark seemed to circle back to that same place when he felt like this, like a bruise he couldn't help but press. He couldn't do this. Not today. Standing up, he grabbed his coat, walked back into the kitchen, and kissed Martha on the cheek. "I'm going to work early." She paused, looking at him with eyes that tried to be encouraging, but carried a shadow of concern. "All right, dear. Have a good day," she said, brushing a hand over his shoulder. "And remember, one day they'll be calling you for interviews." He snorted, more to himself than to her. "Yeah, one day." The day moved with a dull throb, like a slow drumbeat he couldn't escape. He taught English at the local high school, and by the afternoon, fatigue had settled into his bones. In his last period, some of his students started whispering and snickering in the back row. One of them, Kyle, a smirking teenager with too much confidence and not enough tact, waved a newspaper in the air, his voice cutting through the background noise with an edge that made the writer's stomach twist before the words even came. "Hey, teacher, we read your story in the Gazette. So, do they pay you for that stuff? Or do you just do it for fun?" Laughter erupted around the classroom, bouncing off the walls like an unwelcome echo, each chuckle tightening the knot in his chest. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to relax, to play it cool, to remind himself that these were just kids, kids who didn't know the weight their words carried, kids who would go home and forget about this moment while it would carve itself into his ribs and settle there. With an air of tired apathy, he looked at them and quirked a faint smile, the kind meant to deflect, to make it all seem like it didn't matter. "Glad to know my work is being read," he said dryly, hoping the comment would glide over them, that they would let it drop, that he wouldn't have to sit in this discomfort any longer. "Now, how about we get back to Hamlet, yeah?" The bell finally rang, a sound that should have felt like relief, but instead felt like the inevitable breaking of a dam. Chairs scraped against the linoleum as students bolted from their seats, racing toward the door, toward their cars, toward the world outside that had never felt as claustrophobic to them as it did to him. He gathered his papers slowly, methodically, feeling each second stretch and weigh down on him. the remnants of laughter still echoing in his skull. Outside, his old '56 Plymouth sat waiting, a loyal but battered thing that had seen better days, much like its owner. He sank into the seat, the worn leather sighing beneath him, and turned the key in the ignition. The car coughed, whined, and then went silent. He cursed under his breath, pumping the gas pedal, trying again. This time the engine sputtered to life and he threw the car into reverse, backing out of his teacher's only spot before it could change its mind. He drove aimlessly at first, the roads blurring together as he tried to shake off the day's heaviness, but Martha's voice chimed in his head as he remembered. "Don't forget the wine for tonight, and don't buy the cheapest one, okay? We might be broke, but we're not poor." "Right. Mid-tier," he muttered to himself, scanning the street for a liquor store. The sign for Dunworth's General Store came into view, the faded lettering barely visible against the overcast sky. Pulling into the little strip mall parking lot, he barely registered the red and white 1958 Plymouth Fury until it was too late, jerking the wheel at the last second to avoid clipping it, his tires scraping against the curb. He sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, exhaling sharply. He'd never seen anything like it. It looked custom, one of a kind, pristine in a way that didn't belong in a place like this. "Made in America," he muttered with a grin, shaking his head before stepping out of the car. Inside, the store was cramped, dimly lit, the shelves overflowing with bottles of all shapes and sizes. His eyes skimmed the price tags, his hand hovering over a $10 bottle before Martha's voice echoed again in his mind, a quiet reminder of standards, of dignity, of not settling for less even when life tried to force it upon them. He picked something better, a $29.99 Cabernet. Not fancy, but decent enough. Just enough to keep up the illusion of choice. Why not just call it $30, he thought as he made his way to the counter. The Plymouth's owner was there, easy to spot in his red jacket, the car's name Fury emblazoned across the back in chrome script, a perfect match to the machine parked outside. The pride radiated off him, something tangible, something bordering on obsession. "Nice car, man," the struggling writer said, offering an acknowledging nod. The man grinned, teeth flashing in a way that felt too sharp, too knowing. "Yeah, but she can be a little temperamental, a bit like a jealous girlfriend when you spot a younger model." "Ha ha, you know what I mean." The writer nodded again, a polite smile, the kind you give when you don't want to invite more conversation. He paid for the wine, watching as the man strutted out of the store, his movements almost too aggressive, something simmering beneath the surface, a quiet rage wrapped in a well-polished grin. By the time he got home, the sky had turned soft indigo, the world slipping into that in-between space where daylight gave up and the night took over. The stars were scattered across the sky like glitter against a velvet canvas, indifferent to the weight pressing down on him. Martha was already at the door, waving at him with a smile that was tired but real, the kind of smile that made the whole day feel just a little less unbearable. She didn't care if he brought back a cheap bottle or the most expensive vintage on the shelf. She just wanted him home, wanted them to feel normal for a little while. He stepped inside, letting the warmth of the trailer settle around him, familiar and yet stifling all at once. He set the bottle of wine on the counter, gave Martha a quick kiss, their lips barely brushing, an absent kind of affection, the kind that came from too many days spent carrying too many things alone. "How was your day?" she asked, searching his face for something she could fix with an encouraging word, a small gesture, anything to soften the edges. He replied, shrugging as he took off his coat. "The kids read my story in the paper. They made fun of it." Martha's smile faltered for half a second, just enough for him to notice, before she forced something reassuring into place. "I'm sorry," she said softly, reaching out to touch his arm. Kids can be cruel, but look, at least they're reading. They're talking about your work, even if they don't understand it." He nodded, but it felt hollow. They weren't talking about his work, they were laughing at it, at him. It wasn't discussion, it wasn't interest, it was a joke at his expense. And the worst part was that he knew it wouldn't be the last time. As the night moved on, the feeling didn't leave him. It clung to his skin, to his thoughts, a weight he couldn't shake. He stepped outside, taking a beer with him, letting the cool air bite at his skin. The street was quiet, nothing but the distant hum of a television leaking from a neighbor's window and the occasional rumble of a passing car. And then he saw it, the red and white Plymouth Fury, parked across the street, half hidden beneath the dull glow of a street lamp, its chrome glinting under the moonlight like a predator waiting in the dark. His stomach twisted. The guy from the liquor store didn't live around here. He was sure of it. And yet there it was, sitting there like it belonged, like it had been waiting for him. Coincidence? Had to be. But the unease sat heavy in his chest as he turned back toward the door. He stole one last glance over his shoulder. The car was gone. His breath caught. Hadn't heard it start. He wasn't sure he believed it was just a coincidence. Forcing a smile as he stepped back inside, pushing the door shut with a quiet click, trying to shake the sensation creeping along the back of his neck. Martha looked up from where she was sitting at the table, her eyes catching his just long enough to register something beneath the surface, a flicker of unspoken concern. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice gentle but measured, the way someone speaks when they already know the answer. "Yeah, just needed some air." She didn't push, just shifted slightly, making room for him at the table, an invitation that felt heavier than it should have. He sat down, the scrape of the chair against the floor louder than necessary, filling the space between them. The wine sat unopened, the bottle dark and waiting. He thought about pouring himself a glass, thought about the slow burn of alcohol as it slid down his throat, thought about how it used to dull the edges that had started cutting deeper in the past few months. Instead, he just stared at it. The kids had long since gone to bed, their voices nothing more than a muffled backdrop of sleep-heavy murmurs behind closed doors. The house felt settled, but he didn't. Something about the way the night folded around the trailer, thick and unshaken, felt unnatural. He tried to focus on Martha's voice, the casual rhythm of her words as she recounted her day, the small victories and frustrations wrapped up in grocery store encounters and neighborly gossip. He wanted to listen, wanted to let her words ground him in the normalcy of their life, but his mind kept drifting back to the street outside. It wasn't just the car, it was the way it had disappeared. He hadn't heard the engine, hadn't seen the headlights flicker against the pavement. 1 second it had been there, and then it hadn't. A coincidence. It had to be. He forced himself to focus, nodding in the right places, offering small hums of acknowledgement as Martha talked, but the weight in his chest wouldn't ease. He wasn't even sure what he was afraid of. The car? The man who owned it? The way it made him feel like something was pressing just beneath the surface of reality, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. "You're distracted," Martha said suddenly, breaking through the fog of his thoughts. He blinked, shifting in his seat. "No, You are," she interrupted, but her voice was soft, not accusing, just knowing. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing against his. "Talk to me." He hesitated, considering telling her, considering laying out the strange unease curling around his ribs like something living. But how could he explain it? "I saw a car that shouldn't have been there, and then it was gone." It sounded ridiculous even in his own head. So instead, he just shook his head and gave her a small, tired smile. "It's nothing. Just long day." She studied him for a moment, her fingers lingering before she pulled away, accepting his answer but not believing it. "Okay," she said finally, but her voice caught. "You'd tell me if it was something real, yeah?" He nodded, lying. Later, after the shower and a quick change into something that at least passed for put together, they drove to the Cooper's house for the dinner party. The Coopers lived in a house that looked like it had been plucked from a home improvement magazine. Clean lines, polished hardwood floors, decorations that spoke of curated taste rather than personal warmth. Everything in its place, everything just so. As they walked up to the door, Martha squeezed his hand, the pressure small but deliberate, a quiet reminder that they were supposed to be here, that they belonged in this space even if it didn't feel like it. The party itself was predictable. The same faces, the same conversations, the same polite inquiries about work and life and kids, the same undercurrent of small-town gossip that filled the air like background music. Martha slid into the rhythm effortlessly, her laugh easy, her words light, weaving between conversations like she had always been a part of them. He, on the other hand, hovered at the edges, sipping his wine slowly, nodding at the right times, letting the conversations swirl around him without fully engaging. It wasn't long before the inevitable question found him. "So I hear you're a writer?" The man asking was older, his graying beard neatly trimmed, his suit casual but expensive. There was something in his eyes that suggested curiosity, but not genuine interest, the kind of question asked for the sake of asking, to fill silence rather than seek an answer. He forced a polite smile, the well-rehearsed one that never quite reached his eyes. "Yeah, something like that." "What kind of stuff do you write?" "Mostly horror, dark fiction." The man's eyebrows lifted slightly, his mouth twisting into something between amusement and mild discomfort. "Horror, huh? Guess that's a tough sell. Not exactly mainstream, is it?" "Nope," he agreed, taking another sip of wine, letting the conversation die on its own. It didn't. "Ever think about writing something a little more, I don't know, accessible? Ever thought about writing something your kids could read?" He smiled again, this time sharper. "I'll consider it." The man nodded as if he had offered some profound wisdom, then turned his attention to someone else, the conversation dismissed as easily as it had started. He exhaled slowly, setting his glass down, feeling the weight settle deeper. He found a quiet corner, watching as Martha navigated the room with ease, envying her ability to fit, to belong. She caught his gaze across the room, offering him a sympathetic smile, a small lifeline in the noise of it all. He tried to return it, but it felt strained, like the muscles in his face no longer knew how to hold warmth. By the time they finally got home, Martha looked exhausted. She let out a deep sigh as she kicked off her shoes, stretching her arms above her head. "I'm beat," she said, her back cracking with the motion. "Think I'll get ready for bed. You coming?" "In a bit," he replied. "I might just write for a little while." She hesitated in the doorway, studying him again, that same quiet concern from earlier still lingering. "Okay, but don't stay up too late, okay?" "Promise," he said. They both knew it was a promise he wouldn't keep. The trailer was quiet once Martha disappeared down the hall, the stillness stretching long and thin, the kind of silence that felt deliberate, unnatural. The hum of the old Westinghouse refrigerator filled the space, a low, steady noise that had always been there, had always been part of the trailer. But tonight, it felt intrusive. He wandered toward his desk, the typewriter waiting, the blank page staring back at him like a pestilent child demanding attention. He sat down, fingers hovering over the keys, waiting for something to come. But instead, all he heard was the scratching. Soft at first, barely there, a faint rhythmic scrape against wood, coming from behind the wall. His breath hitched. He told himself it was nothing, just the trailer settling, just his mind playing tricks on him after the weight of the day. But then it came again, longer this time, deliberate, not the sporadic shifting of old foundations, not the wind slipping through unseen cracks. Something was in there. His fingers curled against the desk, his pulse picking up as he strained to listen, his body rigid with a tension he couldn't name. The scratching stopped, but the silence felt worse. The scratching had stopped, but its absence was not a relief. If anything, the silence felt heavier now, stretched too thin, like an old rope fraying at the edges. He sat motionless at his desk, his breath shallow, ears straining for any sign of movement behind the wall. The hum of the old refrigerator filled the space again, grounding him for a moment, but the sound did nothing to ease the tension coiling in his chest. The rational part of him knew what it wanted to believe, that it was nothing, that old houses creaked, that the trailer settled differently at night, that his mind was exhausted from the weight of rejection, from the students' laughter, from the quiet judgment at the dinner party. But the deeper, quieter part of him, the one that had always been open to the unknown, the part that wrote the kind of stories people turned away from, whispered something else. His fingers hovered over the typewriter keys again, but the words did not come. He stared at the blank page. It mocked him, at the pile of crumpled drafts littering the floor, and he thought, maybe this is it. Maybe the words are done with me. The thought settled like a stone in his stomach. Writing had always been his escape, his way of clawing his way out of the darkness. But if the words were gone, if they had abandoned him, what was left? A sharp creak echoed through the trailer, breaking the thought before it could fully form. His breath caught in his throat, fingers clenching against the edge of the desk. The sound had not come from the wall. This time it had come from the hallway. He turned his head slowly, pulse hammering against his ribs. The trailer was dark, the only light coming from the weak glow of his desk lamp. The hallway stretched beyond it, empty, but something about the shadows felt wrong, too deep, too still. The door to the bedroom was closed. Martha was asleep. The kids were asleep. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to exhale. Just tired, just imagining things. He pushed himself away from the desk, the chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. The sound made him wince. It felt too loud, too intrusive, as if it had called attention to him, as if something had been waiting for him to move. He hesitated for a moment longer, then stood, shaking off the weight of his thoughts, forcing his legs to carry him toward the bedroom. The hallway bit at his bare feet, colder than it had any right to be. He walked quickly, not daring to look into the dark corners, not letting his eyes linger on the shadows that seemed to shift just out of sight. By the time he reached the bedroom door, his hands were trembling. He told himself it was from exhaustion, from stress, from the endless failures piling up in his life. But when he slipped into bed beside Martha, pulling the covers over himself, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching him the entire way. Sleep did not come easily. When he woke, it was still dark. The clock on the nightstand read 3:16 a.m., the kind of time that sat between real and unreal, the dead space of the night where things moved in the dark, where thoughts turned inward, where the mind whispered things it shouldn't. The room was still, Martha's slow, even breathing the only sound. For a moment he thought he had imagined whatever had pulled him from sleep. Then he heard it, the scratching. It was louder now, closer. His stomach twisted as he turned his head toward the sound, his eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering in through the curtains. The noise wasn't coming from the walls this time. It was coming from inside the room. His breath caught and he went completely still, listening. The sound was deliberate, a slow, dragging scrape against wood, like fingernails skimming the surface of the nightstand. His nightstand. His body felt disconnected from his mind, locked in place by something primal. Every instinct screamed at him not to look, not to acknowledge it, to stay still, to pretend he hadn't heard it. But his eyes betrayed him, flicking toward the source of the sound before he could stop himself. Nothing. The nightstand was empty, but the sound was still there. His breath was coming too fast now, his chest rising and falling in short, shallow bursts. He clenched his hands into fists beneath the covers, forcing himself to slow down, to think. The shadows in the room seemed thicker, the corners darker. He turned his gaze toward the doorway, toward the hall beyond, and a fresh wave of unease crawled down his spine. The door was open. He was certain he had closed it before bed. A single cold bead of sweat rolled down his temple as he stared at the empty space beyond the threshold. The hallway was silent, stretching into the darkness, the weak glow of the kitchen light barely reaching past the doorway. His ears strained for any sound, any shift, but there was nothing. The scratching had stopped. The house was silent again. But the silence no longer felt empty. It felt waiting. Martha stirred beside him, shifting in her sleep, murmuring something unintelligible before rolling onto her side. The small human sound grounded him, pulling him back from the edge of the fear coiling around his ribs. He forced himself to take a slow, deep breath, then another. When he looked back toward the hallway, the open door, the stretching dark, he told himself he had simply forgotten to close it, that the sound had been nothing, that his mind was playing tricks on him, twisting exhaustion into something more sinister. He closed his eyes. Eventually, sleep found him. By morning, the night before felt distant, like something half-remembered from a fever dream, still unsettling, but easier to dismiss under the weight of daylight. The sun streamed weakly through the curtains, turning the dust in the air to floating gold specks. The muffled sounds of Martha moving around the kitchen, the clinking of mugs, the soft muttering of the radio, grounded him back into reality. He sat up slowly, rubbing a hand over his face, trying to shake the lingering tension coiled in his chest. His head ached, his body sluggish, as if he'd spent the night wrestling something unseen. For a moment he just sat there, staring at the floor, at the way the morning light stretched across the carpet. He had work in a few hours, more students to teach, more polite smiles that barely covered the condescension, more whispers that felt like tiny, deliberate cuts. Instead of getting up, he sat at his desk, resting his fingers on the keys of his typewriter, the cool metal grounding him. The blank page waited, expectant, but he hesitated, staring at the empty space where words should be. He exhaled slowly, tapping one key, then another. The first line came simple and unobtrusive. The baby's first cry split the night. He stopped. Something about it felt wrong. Not the words themselves, but the way they settled on the page, the way they sat there, waiting. His skin prickled, a slow, crawling sensation running along his arms. He stared at the sentence, willing himself to find the problem, but there was none. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't come from him. His fingers hovered over the keys, the weight of something unspoken pressing down on him. The smell of coffee drifted in from the kitchen. Martha's voice, faint, talking to the kids. The scrape of a chair. The normalcy of it all should have comforted him, but instead it only made the unease worse. The typewriter sat silent, the sentence unmoving. He swallowed and ripped the page from the machine, crumpled it, tossed it aside. Not today. Pushing away from the desk, he stood and stretched, rolling the stiffness from his shoulders. The weight in his chest hadn't lifted, but at least now, in the daylight, it felt manageable. "Breakfast?" Martha called from the kitchen. He ran a hand through his hair, forcing a small, tired smile before heading toward the smell of coffee and something almost like peace. But as he left the room, a soft click echoed behind him. The typewriter clicked. One key, slow and deliberate, a single letter inked itself on the blank page. This chapter may have ended, but the story doesn't. Return next Monday for what waits in the dark. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and leave a comment to share what the shadows may have whispered to you.